Hello casters, and welcome to this beginner's guide to the fire element in Elestrals. Today I'm going to break down all of the runes fire has access to, as well as the best Elestrals you can be playing. I'm also going to touch on the pros and cons of playing fire currently in the metagame, and discuss the current best builds. There's a guide just like this for every element in Elestrals on the channel, so if you find this video helpful, make sure you check out my others. But for now, let's cook with fire. Starting off then with fire's divine rune, we have Hephaestus. When you cast this, you can enchant up to 3 fire to it, and you can disenchant 1 fire from this Hephaestus in order to search your deck for an artifact and add it to your hand. Hephaestus is not the greatest, honestly. Even though you're able to add a number of cards to our hand, artifacts aren't really the best cards in the game in Elestrals right now. They force you to commit even more spirits onto the board, but there are a number of runes which punish Elestrals attacking, and when your empowered Elestral is removed, you also lose the artifact and the spirits underneath it. So when your opponent sets a number of back row cards, it's really risky to use artifacts. That leads us on to the Hammer of Hephaestus, which is a 2 fire spirit artifact. The empowered Elestral gets +1 attack for each enchanting rune on your field. Also, while Hephaestus is enchanted, the empowered Elestral cannot be targeted by opponents' Elestral effects. Yes, it's a big attack buff for you, but like I said, you're just adding so much risk to your attack that turn. Cards like Poison Tipped Arrow, Shield of Achilles essentially nullify this, and you end up losing out on spirits. Fire has its usual stadium, the Volcanic Forge, which is just adding +1 attack and defense for each fire spirit enchanting your Elestrals. But there is also the Ursa Den. It's a Fire Frost stadium. I'm going to be honest, this one's pretty bad, but it does buff attack and defense of Ursa Elestrals by 1. And every time you cast an Ursa, you can enchant more spirits onto the Ursa Den itself, and then you can disenchant Vor to special cast an Ursa from hand or deck. This is just a slow card. It gives your opponent many turns to remove the stadium, and the payoff just isn't massive. Ursa is actually a strategy we'll talk about in this video, but the Den never makes it into the list. Onto the Invoke runes then, we have Eruption. It's a 2 fire Invoke rune that forces the opponent to expend 3 spirits. If they control a fire enchanted Elestral, it's only going to be 1 instead, but this is our big burn option. It's only a +1 differential for you, but if you see this card as a game ender, that's where its strength lies. We also have Stoke the Forge. This can only be cast if Volcanic Forge is enchanted, but you get to search your deck for a 1 Fire Spirit Elestral and add it to your hand. This is a great card to add consistency to our list, and allows us to time the right Elestral to react to the opponent's board. Onto the counter runes, and Fire actually has access to a few here. We have Follow the Wisps, which cost 1, and targets an Elestral on your field. Your other Elestrals can't be attacked this turn as long as that Elestral is enchanted. It can be a good way for you to enable a sort of swarming archetype if you have a higher defense Elestral that maybe then lets you make some Nexus plays or ascend into other things. Don't Poke the Bear is a really powerful counter rune. This card can only be cast during the battle phase, but you target an Ursa Elestral and give it +4 attack, +4 defense until the end phase. This is the card that makes the Ursa deck worth playing, because it's a very spirit efficient combat trick with a huge buff in stats. And then finally we have Chains of Prometheus. It's a 2 fire counter rune that can only be cast when your opponent activates a counter rune of their own. You can negate that rune, and your opponent returns a spirit from their underworld to their spirit deck. It's a little bit awkward once again. You're losing out on a couple spirits and your opponent gets a refund, so typically this doesn't make it into fire decks. Moving on to the Nexus and Receive options for fire, we start with Kindleo. It's a 3/1 body and can Nexus up to 2 fire spirits. When you do, you can target and destroy an opponent's Elestral. This is a fantastic option to clear the opponent's board of a big threat, and because you're Nexusing, if Kindleo clears the board entirely, you can be swinging for a lot of spirit damage. Next up we have Exalt Flare. It's a 3/2 that can also Nexus up to 2 fire spirits. When you do, you can special ascend this Exalt Flare to an Elestral with the enchantment cost of fire or 2 fire from hand. There isn't really a host of good targets we can special ascend into. I think Blazerus is probably the standout Elestral right now that comes to mind. So this Exalt Flare is really kind of lying in wait for some better options. Next up we have Comagma. It's a 4/2 body, and when this receives 1 or more fire spirits, you can draw a card, then discard a card. There are a couple synergies in the game that enjoy discard, and it is helping you dig deeper into your deck, so it's not a terrible option, and it's a reasonably sized body that could make it into some Nexus builds. And finally we have Ash Rabbit. It's a 2/5, which is very respectable, and when it receives 1 or more fire spirits, you can target 3 cards in your underworld. then your opponent chooses one of them and it's returned to your hand or spirit deck. This is an incredibly powerful mid to late game card because you're going to give your opponent a choice that's never going to be that great for them. But Ash Rabbit is an awkward draw in the opening stages where you're really not going to get much value out of it. Meaning that Ash Rabbit's probably going to be like a 1 or 2 count at most in your deck, but it's a phenomenal card to see going into those later turns. Onto the other staples in Fire then, we start with Necruff. It's a 5/1, and when this Necruff destroys an opponent's Celestial in battle, that opponent must expend 1 spirit. This card is very well statted and forces pressure out the opponent when it connects with attacks, making it one of the main staples of Fire. Next up we have Rumacol. It's just a 2/2, but when you normal cast this, you can search your deck for a Stadium Rune or a Stoke the Forge and add it to your hand. Then this Rumacol gets +1 attack for each fire enchanting it, as long as Volcanic Forge is enchanted. So Rumacol does push itself up to a 4/3 when you have the Forge, and you can always search the Forge with its own cast. It's a little bit less aggressive than something like a Jolton in Thunder, but it's still a reasonably sized body, and the fact that you can also get Stoke the Forge is a big upside. Next up we have Lavalith. This is a limited to 1 copy card in all decks. It's a 6/4 body that can be normal cast for 2 fire spirits if an opponent has at least 2 or more enchanting spirits than you. And when you cast this Lavalith, you can target and destroy a rune. This is an absolutely incredible combat card and massively punishes Nexus strategies, and specifically the likes of Thunder and Earth, which are both very high tier threats in the game right now, by having removal for their Divine Rune. Lavalith is honestly so good that many players will choose to just have 1 Lavalith and 2 fire spirits in their main deck, just for the chance to see this card, because it's an immediate large body with inbuilt rune destruction. Then we have a couple of the Ursas, which works really nicely with that Don't Poke the Bear counter rune. The Scout is a 1/3 fire Elestral, and when it's destroyed in battle, you can special cast a 1 spirit Ursa Elestral from your hand or deck. So it really just adds consistency to your Ursir, which is a 3/1, and when it destroys an Elestral in battle, you can special cast 1 spirit Ursa Elestral from your hand or deck. As you can see, there's a bit of a swarm approach going on here with lots of special casting, and there are a couple of strong Frost Ursas which really benefit from all of this special casting, becoming big beatsticks. There are a couple interesting fire ascensions that we can look at. Vesuvatuga is an Earth and Fire 5/8 body, and you can expend 1 fire to force an opponent to expend 2 spirits. Also, when a player casts Eruption, you can return up to 2 Earth spirits from your Underworld to your spirit deck. So if you want to play an Eruption burn style approach, Vesuvatuga is definitely a nice payoff card, and in its own right, thanks to its tankiness, can just sit in play and keep forcing the opponent to expend turn by turn. Then we have Blazerus. It's a 2 cost 7/2, and this Blazerus can attack twice during your battle phase. When this Blazerus destroys a second Elestral in the same battle phase, you can then special ascend this Blazerus into a Trifernal from your hand or deck. Honestly, we're not too interested in that secondary effect, just the fact that this can attack twice is the big sell here. It means that we can clear an Elestral off the board, then immediately attack the opponent's spirit deck. So finding an opportunity to Nexus multiple spirits to this 1 Blazerus can lead to a huge heap of damage going directly to the opponent. There is a kind of gimmicky archetype in the game right now where you can try and deny the opponent from using counter runes, casting this Blazerus and Nexusing everything you can all to it. The most impressive fire archetypes right now is the Ursa archetype as well as a Fire Nexus approach. Don't Poke the Bear really is what carries the Ursa deck. It's what allows you to get all of this special casting going, making your Abomin Ursa a big threat, and it constantly makes the opponent wary of attacking into you. Whereas the Fire Nexus archetype really just tries to cash in on the synergy of Kindleo and Necruff, where they both inherently force the opponent to expend a number of spirits. Because Hephaestus is such a poor Divine Rune and we want to play a Nexus approach, players have opted towards an Argo package to capitalize on Necklace of Harmonia to give this deck a combat trick, protecting your Kindleo, which then in turn becomes a Nexus bank for you to start dealing massive damage with that Kindleo. Onto the pros and cons then. Fire has a great searcher in Smoltuga. This is actually a Water Elestral. It's a 2/5 body that grabs a 1 Spirit Fire directly to hand. And it's actually nice that there is this internal synergy with Fire and Water, because there are just more very good Water Elestrals in the game. Having easy access to Elestrals like Smoltuga, Eddy, Galaxy is fantastic, and it even gives you justification for Tsunami in your list. But it also means playing Tech Fire Elestrals is much more reasonable, especially because you also have Stoke the Forge available if you want to play those Rumacol. The other main benefit of Fire right now is that your opponent is constantly in fear of Eruption, because as you get down to the late game, there's a possibility that you can just burn them out. With your opponent trying to play around Eruption in those later stages, they may be off-put from using some of their final counter runes, so you're actually limiting their plays, even if you're not using Eruption in your main deck. And as for the downsides of Fire, well, unfortunately, right now, Hephaestus kind of sucks. There really aren't enough strong artifact cards in the game, and it directly competes with Argo regardless, which is just a better option, to be honest. Argo's expensive, but it allows you to time these artifacts to be much more impactful, whereas Hephaestus kind of just gets them in hand for you to then play out and spend even more spirits, which just plays terribly into most back row. Obviously, that's not always going to be the case for Hephaestus, but I do think we need to see more artifacts to actually really start seeing a payoff of this Divine Rune. The other main thing lacking for Fire right now is many good healing options, and they lack rune removal. I mean, yes, you had Lavalith, but now you can only play one copy. So to me, it definitely feels difficult to play a completely Fire archetype, and it's probably going to be best just utilising its good 5s, whilst weaving in some Water Elestrals with Smoltuga to search, or stop me if you've heard this one before, adding in some Thunder. So it definitely feels like Fire has some strong parts, but isn't quite a coherent strategy just yet, and probably needs to cherry pick from other elements to make a more coherent strategy. I'm leaving a link in the description to a Cube Koga document. This is normally used for Pokemon, but I've imported all the important Elestrals into this website. So if you want to brush up on all of the best and most interesting Elestrals as well as runes in the game, feel free to get reading. And at the same time, there's also a chunk of deck lists you can take a look at for some of the top archetypes in the game. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Check out the other elements as well, and I'll see you for another video. Cheers.